Okay, the fellow that's going to speak next is an unassuming man, right? We don't think has any sighting experiences. He's had no trips. He's been to no planets. He's not a contactee. He's a writer, a researcher, right? He was working for a PhD, history. Went off and did other things. And then one day he decided, well, this is a pretty important issue. I think I'm going to research it. Came at the subject with no biases. Didn't even know who most of us were, fortunately for him. Eventually he found out. How he's dealing with it, therapy, whatever. But he wrote a book, which it turns out, which I by the way, have delivered many copies personally with letters attached from XPAC to members of Congress, particularly the committee chairs. I have invited by letter and by XPAC alerts every member of Congress to read this book, every member of the political press to read this book. He just happened to crank out the best primer on the fundamental issue of the relationship between an emerging national security state, which you and I are all starting to learn a little bit more about every day, and the UFO cover-up, which was one of its major concerns for 50 years. Straightforward, concise history, it's right there. If Ted Koppel would read this book, I'd be getting on there at least 2 times a month. My speaking fees would go straight up. And I promise that if I get on, I'm going to bring Rich on with me so that they can't fill that chair with Phil Klass, but that's another story. So the thing is that he just, the right book at the right time. The moment I saw it, I immediately got him on Mart Bell, started promoting this book. He's working on the 2nd volume, right? He needs to get it done quickly, by the way, but he wants to do it right, okay? Believe it or not, there's people in this field doing things right every single day, and yet they keep raising these issues about you don't know what you're talking about, or you're distracted. And then Michael Persinger's got these electrode helmets that he's putting on people saying, oh, that's why they're going to the conference. You stimulate this thing over here, and they rush right down to the Hilton and go to the conference. I love Michael. I'm really going to try to get with him. It's nonsense. Biggest issue in history, quality people covering it. This guy is going to get some feedback. He's going to get some important awards on this book. This book is going to have some long-term legs. It's going to be a significant book. It's going to be one of the major pieces from this thing. And if he writes a second one, I can really go on even longer about him. But because he has it, this is all he gets. I want you to give a great round of applause for Richard Dolan.
Stephen, thank you very, very much. That's a very gracious introduction. Now, I want to make sure everyone hears me. I'm told you guys in the back often don't. Let's extend this out. Perfect. All right? You all can hear me. Good. Now, look, everything Steve said sounds more or less accurate. We have, in UFO research, you know what we have? This is a tiger by the tail. This is what we have. And the tiger is UFO reality and the cover-up of that reality. And the tail are documents, right? The tail are historical documents that we have. So what I want to do is to go through some history, some good history. I don't want to bore you. If throughout this you start feeling ho-hum, been through this before, I don't say this in a snide way, but the door's right there. There are other people doing other things. I'm going to review the foundations of American national security interaction with UFO phenomena, basically from the 1940s to the early 70s right now, which is essentially the theme of my book. I am indeed working on Volume 2, and that will take the story to the present day. I've got a lot done on Volume 2. For those of you interested, I've got maybe the equivalent right now of a, 300-page book or so. It's not ready. Maybe in a year or two. So that's what this is about today. There are some of these speakers here. I have, I love meeting speakers at these conferences. I feel like I'm in the presence of very advanced college professors. I feel like a kindergarten teacher. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And what I mean simply is that this is a topic, okay, that you have to deal with on multiple levels. Multiple levels. And by that I simply mean you get into this field, as I did about 10 years ago, roughly, thinking, what the heck is going on? Is this real or is this nonsense? We have a schizophrenic society. We have an official culture in which this is all nonsense, right? And then we have an unofficial culture, I call it, in which this is quite real and taken very seriously by some very, very brilliant, well-plugged-in individuals. So obviously we have a discrepancy here. What accounts for that? That is what drove me into this field. So you start at an early level, at a beginning level, trying to ascertain the validity of of some of the more interesting facts about this. You go further and further and further, and this field is like a rabbit hole into true psychedelia. And you go into some very strange things. This is a mind-bending, reality-bending study. Now, I am not going there today. There are other people who will. They got the pedal to the metal, they're in fifth gear, and they're moving ahead. I'm staying in the slow lane here. And the reason I'm doing that is because it is my intention to maintain a dialogue with a mainstream culture that thinks this is nonsense. We have an impenetrable black wall of secrecy and denial. And the way to break it is through very, very careful elaboration of perfectly documentable facts. We live in what we tell ourselves is a free republic, a democratically structured society. It's a society that's got some trouble with it right now regarding that premise. But if we are to maintain an adherence to free principles and a republican institution, then what we must do is maintain our control over our history. And the way to maintain control over history is through an understanding of those fundamental historical documents. Without that, we are spinning our wheels and will never have forward motion. We have to maintain a sense of the fundamental principles. And that's what I intend to go through now. Next slide, please. There's René Descartes. You think, what is this guy doing in a UFO presentation? I'll tell you right now, very briefly. I study more than UFOs. I'm actually into philosophy and history and Roman Stoicism and all that weird stuff. I love Descartes. Descartes founded, essentially, the modern philosophical sensibility, modern scientific understanding. How did he do that? Descartes was a brilliant young guy, went to school, realized that he was smarter than his professors, started asking really impertinent questions that they could not answer. Descartes started to wonder, well, how do I really know what's true at all? How do I know how to base any knowledge? And, of course, this led him to, at first, doubt everything that he knew. You know, maybe we're just an idea in the mind of God and we're just an illusion. And then he came up with his famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. All that means, you know what? It means, here's something that I know. I'm thinking. Therefore, I must exist. What Descartes was trying to do was to establish a foundation of unassailable truths upon which to build a foundation of knowledge. And that is exactly what I want to do in the UFO research. Let us build an unassailable foundation upon which we can build a structure. Okay? Next slide, please. Now, look, I'm going to review some of these in a very cursory fashion. Reason is, I prepared this talk way too long, and we've got a 50-minute thing to do this, 45 minutes, whatever. Some of these early things I'm going to blow through a little more quickly. We all have heard of some of the pre-1947 encounters that U.S. military personnel have had with unknown phenomena. This is one of the earlier ones that we know is well documented, an incident over Los Angeles, February 1942. A couple of months after Pearl Harbor, everyone's war crazy, war nerves. And over L.A., this is a real photograph that appeared the next day in the Los Angeles Times. Objects appeared over L.A., were fired at by over 1,400 rounds. 6 individuals died that day, 3 directly, 3 because of heart attacks attributed to this. We don't know what that object was, okay? And I'm not saying this is alien. I have no idea what this was. What I do know is that right away, 5 years before Roswell, the U.S. military was becoming quite well versed in hiding information pertinent to unknown phenomena. U.S. Navy Secretary said, oh, there was nothing there at all. Nothing, just war nerves. Well, it became clear that it wasn't war nerves, whatever that's supposed to be. There was a there, and this is the there. There have been people who have tried to analyze this image and do a negative and all of this stuff, and it's suggestive that there's something there, indeed. The white dots there are shell fire. The Long Beach Independent stated that, you know, there's something odd. The military is just not answering any questions about this. There seems something very, very unusual. I'm jumping ahead in the 1953 movie War of the Worlds, which I just recently saw. Again, you know, there's a very striking scene in this movie. If you recall, there's the main scientist, some movie star guy, right, plays a scientist, and he's got a girlfriend. Anyway, there's a scene where this object lands. Remember this? And at the crash scene, 1953 movie, there's the scientist, a journalist, and a general. The three of them are together. This is an amazing thing about this movie. The journalist gets right up in the face of the general and the scientist and says, what is this thing? What do you think this is? And the scientist right in front of the general says, well, it's obviously some kind of interplanetary craft. That's fascinating to me because 1953 culture, America wanted to tell itself that this is in fact how we would respond to such an emergency. We would be perfectly open. The media would be all over it. But indeed, the media has not been all over this, as we all know. Next slide, please. Foo Fighters during World War II. A couple of things that are worth remembering about this phenomenon. It is very popular for people to ascribe Foo Fighters to German technology. There is a reason to make such an argument. The Germans during World War II were into some very, very advanced stuff. That's absolutely true. On the bottom there is the Horten flying wing design, which is German. That's an illustration, obviously. Germans were working on some very exotic physics and some very advanced technology. That is true. However, the Foo Fighter phenomenon appeared in both theaters of the war. It's very important to remember this. This is not simply a European phenomenon. We have Foo Fighter reports from the Pacific. Now, if the Germans are playing games with this technology, they were doing it in a theater they were not working in. There is good reason to believe that these were not simply German. What were they? Again, we do not have an official explanation. What we know is that this was investigated by a variety of agencies indicated up there. U.S. 8th Air Force, OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, it kind of morphed into the CIA. British intelligence. We do not have complete reports of any of this stuff to this day, 60 years later. Next slide, please. A year after the war ended, we encounter the phenomena known as ghost rockets. They were called ghost rockets because there was no phrase of flying saucers or UFOs. And that image there does not look like a flying saucer anyway. What it is, I do not know. Again, however, the pattern is consistent. You have a pattern of an extraordinary wave of sightings. Some of these are really quite extraordinary indeed, that did not in any way appear to be natural phenomena. Objects appearing over primarily Sweden and then extending out throughout much of Europe. Now, the United States military was very interested in this, sent James Doolittle over to Sweden to confer with the Swedish military on what was labeled an unofficial visit. Shortly after Doolittle and David Sarnoff appeared there, Swedish press was utterly silent on ghost rockets. Nice coincidence. Many years later, we obtained access to a Swedish defense report which analyzed, which discussed this and essentially did not ascertain where these were. The big question was, did the Russians have some kind of missile that they developed with captured German scientists? This does not seem to be the case. There are a couple of people who have argued this. I think most people do not consider it a compelling argument. We don't have an answer to this day, except that information was covered up throughout. Next slide, please. Now, part of the ghost rocket phenomenon involved objects over Greece. In Greece was the scientist Paul Santorini. He was there in 1946. He's a famous physicist. He worked on the atomic bomb and other high-level projects. According to a statement Santorini made, the Greek government was highly alarmed by these rockets over Greek territory. They said, find out what this is. We're going to give you a team of people to work on this. Santorini said that we did work on it. We determined that these were not Russian and these were not missiles. An important conclusion. Well, you start ruling things out. What could they be? He then said, well, before we could do any more, the Army, after conferring with foreign officials, ordered the investigation stopped. Foreign officials, i.e. U.S. Very interesting. Next slide, please. We move to 1947, the year of the UFO as it appears in the United States. That's Kenneth Arnold in the center of that picture over there. Kenneth Arnold, of course, saw the flying saucers in June 1947. He's surrounded by pilots from the Eastern Airlines sighting from 19... Oh, golly. No, who are those guys? I don't remember. It's a 1947 picture. They're UFO witnesses also. Some people here know. My mind's drawing a blank. Those images on the left are photographs from 1947. The center and the bottom are possibly the first newspaper photographs of UFOs taken by a man named Frederick Rhodes, I believe, or William Rhodes. The top one's a Canadian photograph. Let me talk about... I'm not going to talk about Roswell today. All right, other people can do it. Personally, I think Roswell was real, as in something that U.S. military people retrieved that did not belong to us. Let's say that. Next slide, please. I want to talk about this. Everyone knows about the Twining memo. Look, this is old history. However, some things are so obvious that they become invisible to us. We need to remember why this is significant. This is a very, very important statement. General Nathan Twining was head of Air Material Command over in Dayton, Ohio, Wright Field, and was involved in correspondence with other individuals about the nature of this phenomenon, wrote a memo, next slide please, which stated, we know this, the objects, intelligence reports have come in that indicate this phenomenon is real. It is not fictitious. Describing in detail the nature of these objects, extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, and action which must be considered evasive when sighted. Describing them as metallic or light-reflecting surface, absence of trail, circular or elliptical in shape, flat on bottom and domed on top. This is 1947. What's flat on bottom and domed on top in 1947? Well-kept formation of flights, normally no sound. All of the UFO data that we've become accustomed to. Next slide, please. Now, the Wentworth document, this is a colonel and chief of the operations branch analyzing this over at Wright Field. This is very interesting to me. What Wentworth is saying in this document is that, well, it says right here, we have been constructing models of flying saucers. This is October 1947. Constructing models to be tested in a wind tunnel. As a guide in constructing the models, description from various persons who claim to have sighted these objects were used. All right? They're building flying saucers, not on the basis of captured German technology. No, they're building them on the basis of UFO accounts. What does that mean? The Air Material Command is of the opinion that some sort of object, such as the flying saucer, did exist. Next slide. A famous memo by General Shulgin, who was in correspondence with Nathan Twining. There has been a lot of dispute over this memo because apparently there are two versions of it. One is considered real, one is considered not real. The not real version describes, this is late 1947, describes UFOs as possibly of extraterrestrial provenance, interplanetary thesis being taken seriously, according to the memo. Now, very likely, the interplanetary thesis was indeed being taken seriously. But according to the official version of the memo that we now have, it suggests a belief in the Russian-German origin of these. If you look at the Russian-German origin of flying saucers, in my view, you hit a dead end. And the reason is we do not have any reasonable hard evidence to link German and Russian technological study to the flying saucer phenomenon of late 1940s. There was a very good book written on this topic not long ago by British aviation journalist Nick Cook called The Hunt for Zero Point. And this is a fine book, and Cook essentially tried to investigate the legendary claims of German flying saucers. And what he did, he came into this as really knowing nothing about UFOs. It was obvious reading his book he knew nothing about UFOs when he got into it. And found a little bit more than smoke. He found some very strong evidence to believe that the Germans were working on disc-shaped objects, and they had at least some pretty good prototypes they were working on, maybe a little bit more. There's nothing tangible to hang your hat on here as far as anything operational. And it's also very, very clear now that after the war ended, the United States got the lion's share of these German scientists who were working on these concepts. So you can hypothesize, well, does that mean then that we secretly invented flying saucers? Certainly this is a hypothesis you cannot dismiss. However, even according to Cook's own best conclusion, there is no evidence to show that we had any such breakthrough in the 1940s, nor the 1950s. Cook's own theory is that maybe by the 1960s we had something. So it's problematic, okay, to go that route. Next slide. So you enter 1948. Now look, this is all official stuff. I'm not really delving into the majestic documents here. And the reason I am not is because they are disputed. I'm staying in shallower waters than some other researchers are doing, and this is a good thing at times. If you want to maintain a strong open and shut argument, I maintain you can do it with what is publicly acknowledged to be true. All right, you can do it. What we know at least the upper levels that we're able to dig here, we're not digging into the deepest levels, is that there were three obvious possibilities to the origin of the flying saucer phenomenon when you get to early 1948. They were either Soviet, they were either American, or they were interplanetary, according to the phrase that they used at the time. Not us. Let's say that. And this is a reasonable speculation, right? Where else are they going to come from? Now, I want to just stop for a moment and let us say that... Oh, wait, I think I have the Truman slide next. Next slide, please. All right, no, I will, though. I'm going to hold my thoughts. There were three possibilities by 1948, but there was also an emerging consensus about this phenomenon. And here's what we know. This is very important. That the UFO topic was considered... the UFOs were considered real. They were real. They were objects, technological objects that were being seen. This was taken, for obvious reasons, very seriously. And it was dominated by secrecy. This is a slam dunk, no argument here. Now, it is worth asking, throughout the rest of the history of this phenomenon, have there been any conclusions that officials have arrived at to alter this consensus? The answer is no. The answer is no. Next slide, please. All right, now I'll talk about Harry Truman. Before I knew anything about UFOs, I'd done quite a bit of study on Truman, and I'd read his memoirs, and I'd read a number of books about him by historians, and, none of these mention UFOs. Golly, surprise. Let's do a little thought game here and go back to 1947. Let's pretend that you're Harry Truman, and your senior military people come up to you and advise you. Say, Mr. President, we apparently have recovered technology that is highly exotic. In fact, it's so exotic it doesn't originate from any civilization that we know of. All right. So now you're Truman. What do you do about this? Do you tell the world? Well, I don't think so. And I don't think so because I know for a fact that in 1947, the United States had a monopoly of another important technology, atomic technology, working atomic bombs. And in 1947, it was a very important issue at the United Nations that the demand was that the U.S. make atomic technology under UN control. And it was argued that, this is such an important technology, we can't trust any one nation to have a monopoly of this. That was a very important argument at the time. We forget these days. America's answer was absolutely no way, positively. We're not going to share. That's the quickest way to give this to the Soviets, and we're not going to do that. So we know that the United States was not willing, to say the least, to share atomic technology. You're Truman, 1947. What do you think you're going to do about something as exotic as alien technology? Clearly you're not going to share this with just anyone. No, I think what you would logically do, this is an inference that we can make here. Logically, you would gather together a select group of individuals that you absolutely know and trust, whose scientific and intelligence credentials are unimpeachable, and you say to them, figure this out. What's the deal? What makes this stuff go? Who are they? Where this originates from? And so on. All of the logical questions you can think about. And then you would need to establish security protocols regarding this, wouldn't you? Indeed, you would. You would have to keep this so secret. Essentially, I argue you would have to keep it secret from yourself. You'd have to maintain absolute, ultimate, plausible deniability in any sense of the word. This, I think, the historical evidence supports that thesis far better than any other thesis that I can think of, including the thesis that we invented flying saucers. So that's my thoughts theoretically on the MJ-12 issue. Regarding the documents themselves, there is a mountain of these documents. You print off the documents, for instance, the Majestic files at the Wood website, the Majestic website, and it's more than 2 inches thick of documents. A hoax explanation really needs, if you're going to argue that these are all hoax, you've got to show it. Now some have been shown, but many of these others are very difficult to show that these are hoaxes. In particular, the Special Operations Manual 101 that surfaced in 1993. In any case, regarding Truman, we know for a fact, this is not speculation, that Harry Truman received briefings on UFO phenomena from the middle of 1948 to the end of his presidency. We know this because the man who gave them those briefings, Major General Robert Landry, said so in an oral history interview given in the early 70s, shortly after Truman had died. Landry said, he was a colonel back then, he was the liaison with CIA, briefing Truman on UFOs on a quarterly basis, 4 times a year for 4.5 years. That's, 18 or so briefings by my estimate. Wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall at one of those? Landry said, well, we didn't really, these were informal and we didn't have any documentation on it, trying to imply as a result that they weren't that important because that's why we didn't write anything down. On the other hand, of course, I think many of us realize that no documentation. Well, there's a quote by the CIA Director Richard Helms who states unequivocally, the first rule in keeping secrets is nothing on paper. Nothing on paper. This doesn't prove anything, but we do know that Landry briefed Truman. Now, Truman was a busy man. He was president during the Korean War. He was president during the Berlin airlift. He was president during a lot of heavy-duty difficulties, right? And he's getting briefed on flying saucers 18 or so times. Why? 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 Forget aliens. U.S. media refuses to take this subject seriously. It is a constant joke with mainstream established culture. However, why is no one asking, why was Harry Truman briefed for 4.5 years on a regular basis about UFOs? It is well worth asking this question. Truman, one wonders really what he thought about this privately. We know that in his retirement after he left the White House that he was very concerned, at least he stated his concern, over the growth of the national security apparatus of the United States. He made some comments about the CIA in the early 1960s, calling it, I think this quote was a state within a state, or they've become far too powerful, I think he said. This was after Eisenhower's famous farewell address in which he talked about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. These presidents, they knew that bad things were happening. They knew it. Next slide, please. James Forrestal. James Forrestal is, in a sense, the man who really got me into this topic of UFOs. A number of years ago, I encountered a couple of articles that dealt with Forrestal in a historical way, connecting him to UFOs. And Forrestal's another guy I'd read a lot about. I'd read his diaries, the published versions, read the books that were available on him. And I thought, UFOs? Well, then I thought, well, it would make sense that he would know something about UFOs. He was the first Secretary of Defense of the United States. He would be, theoretically, at the hub of some interesting information, would he not? And then, of course, most of us know James Forrestal's life ended from a 16th floor fall from the Bethesda Naval Hospital in May 1949. It was the very morning of his death, the Navy declared that it was a suicide. Now, look, this is 14 years before Kennedy was assassinated. This is many years before the Freedom of Information Act. This is before the 1960s. Navy says something. Who's going to argue with it? The fact is that there are some very, very odd circumstances regarding the death of James Forrestal. I do personally believe that this man was not a suicide. I personally believe that he was murdered. And I believe that on the basis of many of the events surrounding the night of his death. Essentially, Forrestal, throughout 1948, unhinged. And everyone who knew him saw this. Now, you know, there were a lot of reasons, conventional reasons, why the man might have gotten unhinged. Forrestal, by all accounts, was a very tightly wound sort of guy to begin with. He's the first Secretary of Defense, a position, by the way, that was a far weaker Secretary of Defense than later positions, in the sense that he had no authority to determine budget allotments to force the Joint Chiefs of Staff to accept a certain budget. It was an advisory capacity. It was a weak position. Truman, on the one hand, wanted a balanced budget and a $15 billion defense expenditure for the fiscal year, which even then was low. Joint Chiefs wanted double that at least, and Forrestal was stuck in the middle. And it was essentially an insoluble problem. So that's a reason to lose it there. On the other hand, there are some very odd things about Forrestal's unhinging. He did indeed talk about being followed by foreign-looking men constantly. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean UFOs either, right? But we know Forrestal was in the loop on UFO documentation. There are some documents that refer to Forrestal in the literature. I wish I had photocopied one here for you, and I did not. The circumstance of his death, however, is this. Forrestal's last public appearance was in March 1st, 1949, his going away. After Truman fired him, they gave him a little party. At the conclusion of his speech, he was approached by his political enemy, James Symington, an Air Force secretary, who said, "I want to talk with you privately." They go into a limo. When they emerge in front of Forrestal's office, Forrestal was absolutely, utterly shaken. The next time anyone saw him was hours later, alone in his office, staring at a blank wall, ramrod straight, repeating one sentence: "You are a loyal fellow." And that's the truth. This is in conventional biographies. So they took him to Florida, meeting with Bob, to stay at the home of Bob Lovett, another future Secretary of Defense. Then they take him to Bethesda. He's not allowed to see his priest. He's not allowed to see his family. He's finally allowed to see his brother. His brother, the night before Forrestal died, brother had come to get him. Brother announced to the hospital, "I'm coming to get my brother because I don't like the way that you're keeping him here. I don't think he needs to be here." That was the night Forrestal died. The man on his guard duty the night that Forrestal died was a new Navy corpsman, a man Forrestal had never seen. The regular guard, so it was said, got drunk the night before and was AWOL or was not there. So this new guy comes in an hour and a half into the shift. The new guy wakes up the doctor sleeping in the hallway. It's 1:30 in the morning. The secretary won't take his sleeping medication. What do I do? They go back. Forrestal's gone out the window. That's the official story. There's many other things I can go into here, but I can't because I've only got a few minutes. Next slide. We got a lot of documents here, people. Many, 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 many. All right? We thank the very liberal Freedom of Information Act from the late 1970s for most of these. It's a Freedom of Information Act that doesn't appear to exist anymore. I'm serious. We got one in the late 70s, an FBI memo. Very quickly. This matter is considered top secret by intelligence officers of both the Army and the Air Force. This is 1949. This is a few months before Forrestal died, incidentally. During the past 2 months, various sightings of unexplained phenomena have been reported in the vicinity of the AEC, Atomic Energy Commission installation at Los Alamos. UFOs over Los Alamos. Next slide. Kirtland Air Force Base, 1949. It quotes, "Sighting of identical object reported by 30 people, estimate at least 100 total sightings." All these agencies, local commanders, perturbed by implications of phenomena. Why would they be perturbed by the implications of this phenomena? Now, in 1949, the government was telling people UFOs were hoaxes, hallucinations, misidentification of known phenomena. Well, that's not what they were telling each other. Next slide. Next slide, please. There we go. And some pictures. We got the McMinnville photographs, taken in 1950 by a farmer, Paul Trent. These photographs have never been debunked. They have been defended quite expertly by Dr. Bruce Maccabee and others who have analyzed these photographs. They are real. As far as anyone can tell, these are absolutely real. And in fact, it was in the Condon Committee report, which, although trying to debunk UFOs, did not debunk these photographs. The farmer, Paul Trent, never ever tried to make money off this picture. These pictures, and in fact, into the 1990s, maintained a very low profile. People who knew them would say, "What, them hoax? What are you, nuts?" Next slide, please. We have a crescendo of UFOs in 1952, a very important event in our nation's history. UFO sightings in 1952 peaked in this country to an extraordinary extent. Edward Ruppelt, who was running Blue Book at the time, said if you were to come into one of our offices in summer of 1952, you would have thought we were in invasion mode. That's how serious they were taking it. In June of 1956, in the office of General John Samford, Samford, in fact, is at the bottom of that picture facing with a profile. Samford's office had a meeting with senior officers about this. Ruppelt attended. And an enormous debate ensued among the attendees over one colonel said, essentially, look, why don't we just get right down to business here and talk about extraterrestrials? Why is no one talking about this? Ruppelt wrote, and you could tell the entire room just heaved this sigh like, there, he said it. Well, we have sightings for several weekends over the White House. And that photograph on the far end there, this is a famous photograph. This was sent to me by a skeptic of UFOs who said, hey, see, look, everyone who shows this photograph fails to show the lights on the bottom. And it's obvious, he said, that, the lights on the top are reflections of the lights on the bottom. Well, maybe, except when I look at these, it almost matches, but it really doesn't, actually. And you compare them, you see that there's, I wish I had a little laser pointer, There's, the top row of lights does correspond somewhat to the bottom row up on top, except that the angle of the double lights is totally different. And then the very top row of lights doesn't match the row on the bottom. Anyway, I don't really know what this photograph is real or not. I do know that there were visuals and radar trackings of unknown, unidentifiable objects over the White House by very qualified people. Now, the official explanation, of course, that the Air Force gave to the public was that this is all due to weather phenomena. However, keep in mind the statement of Harry Barnes, who was the senior air traffic controller on the site there. He said, no, it was not weather. And he was adamant about it. Next slide. What we have is that you've got a variety of explanations. You've got the Air Force telling the public it's weather. But then, at the same time, we have documents within the intelligence field discussing the reality of this. We have an Air Force Intelligence Estimate Division document from the same week of the press conference saying the Air Force has failed to arrive at any satisfactory conclusion. Also indicating at this point that the Soviets were probably not behind the UFO phenomenon. Said, well, maybe they're natural phenomenon, although we don't really understand how it could be. And they might actually be alien, although we don't think so, according to this memo. On the other hand, you have a CIA analysis from a few weeks later talking about, again, the bizarre nature of this phenomenon. Sightings of UFOs reported at Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, inexplicable, etc. At a time when background radiation had risen inexplicably. Next slide, please. So essentially, by 1952, you got a serious implication, and in the U.S. intelligence field, they appear to have eliminated, for the most part, the Soviets as a source of this. Now, there are always pockets of people who, consider that maybe the Soviets were a source of this. But by and large, that explanation was ruled out in the major circles no later than 1952. Next slide. The crescendo, in my view, is this memo right here. H. Marshall Chadwell to Director of the CIA, Walter Beadle Smith. This is in December 1952. Truman's administration was on the way out. This is very important to keep in mind. Chadwell writes to Smith, reports of incidents convince us there is something going on which must have immediate attention. Sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of vehicles. It's to the director of the CIA. Now, does he say, well, we think it's alien? No, he doesn't. People dance around, trip around this explanation again and again. No one wants to say in these memos, well, I think it's an ET, but they all but say it. They all but say that we don't, it's someone's technology. Next slide. The result was the Robertson panel. A travesty from one point of view, a great success from another. A travesty from the point of view of science. Robertson panel was held in the final weekend of Truman's presidency. And it was the last bit of house cleaning of the Truman administration. And by that I simply mean, as long as UFOs had been in the public realm, Truman had been president, Truman was now leaving. What do? We want to make sure that this topic is handled in a secure manner. This is my feeling. And so therefore, what they did is they convened Nobel-caliber physicists who met for 12 hours, didn't seem to, they had their conclusions already prearranged for them. And in other words, to compartmentalize this even further, to kind of put the lid over this a little bit more so that you could maintain better control over it with the coming administration. Next slide. Officially, as I said, this is what the Air Force would tell people. That's a Blue Book picture from the 60s, by the way. Many of you probably recognize. Blue Book team trying to look busy. They were, okay, next slide. In the 50s, you had a number of private initiatives that are very important, and I know I'm running out of time. I realize this. I'm going to try to be quick. Roscoe Hillenkoetter ran the CIA from 1947 to 1950. He was on NICAP, which was the most important civilian UFO organization in the country, in the world at that time, for 5 years. NICAP was led by Donald Keyhoe. NICAP, year in, year out, tried to get congressional hearings on UFOs. Hillenkoetter was part of that team. Why? This man ran the CIA. What's he doing on NICAP? Again, questions no historian asks. Next. I definitely want you to see this memo. This is from 1953 over the Oak Ridge nuclear facility. Oak Ridge was the scene of numerous airspace violations by objects doing the impossible. This is one such memo. This is 1953. Object was extremely black in color, having an appearance of deep black metal exterior, fine gloss, all the detail here. The object flew east at a tremendous speed for what appeared to be 3 miles, where it stopped. The object was then joined by 2 more of the same objects. A formation similar to a spread V was formed, and the objects at a tremendous speed flew in an eastward direction. What more can one say? Similar memos on the end there. Maxwell Air Force Base had an emergency airspace violation a year later. Pepperell Air Force Base up in Canada had another one, an extended radar visual encounter. Next slide. Brazilian photograph from 1958. Heck of a photograph. This is one of 3 that were taken aboard a Brazilian Naval Survey ship. Lots of people saw this. There you go. The Brazilian Navy had a top secret report on this that was leaked to UFO researchers Jim and Coral Lorenzen, which concluded that, read the convoluted language here. The case permits the admission that there are indications of the existence of unidentified flying objects. No one can just speak plainly here. Next slide. In the late 50s, early 60s, there's evidence for pressure on certain UFO researchers and people in the field, including these 2. Edward Ruppelt, after he left Blue Book, wrote a heck of a book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. Suffice to say, both of these men did turnarounds at the last, within a short period of time. Hillenkoetter was about to go before Congress in April of '62 to talk about the need to end UFO secrecy. 2 months before, wrote a letter to Keyhoe saying, hey, look, you know what? Let's get off the Air Force's back. They're doing everything they can, and I'm resigning, by the way, from the Board of Governors. Next slide. 1960s, just as America in general was in a state of crisis, so was the field of UFO research. UFO sightings in this country peaked in the mid-60s. And, you know, just as in the 60s when anything seemed possible, so too in the field of UFO disclosure. It seemed that we might be able to break through. There were some congressional initiatives. Gerald Ford, how was that, 10 minutes? Is that what you said? 8? Okay, good. People were talking about, let's get to the bottom of this. Gerald Ford said, public has the right to know. Alan Hynek goes to Michigan, gives his famous swamp gas explanation. His explanation for these particular sightings was actually a little more nuanced than that. But yes, he did attribute these to the emission of swamp gas, made the Air Force look like a laughing stock before the entire world. This became not a credible situation for the Air Force and not acceptable. Therefore, the Air Force decided let's do something about this. Next slide. But before we get to that, let's talk about one last military encounter here in this talk. This is just an exceptional thing. At Malmstrom Air Force Base, 1967. You have multiple sightings. This is an enormous area here, okay? It's missile silos, Minuteman missiles over a large area. There were several locations that had UFOs. In the first location, they noticed a red glowing object hovering above missiles. Below ground, missiles go offline. Coincidence? Maybe, probably not, right? Second location, UFO hovering over site. More than 10 Minuteman missiles go offline. Bing, 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 bing. One after the next. The documentation on this is absolutely beautiful, and it's available on the web. Search it out. Boeing, which operated the missiles, analyzed them, found no technical explanation at all why they went down. This is a copy of the detail of the memo. The fact that no apparent reason for the loss of 10 missiles can be readily identified is cause for grave concern to this headquarters. Indeed, it would be. Next slide. So while that's going on, you got a joke of a study going on out of Colorado, led by that man there, Edward Condon. That's a picture of Condon. Flying saucers, ha-ha, very funny. He's got a picture of a little flying saucer model on the Condon report there. This University of Colorado was charged by the Air Force with investigating UFOs in a scientific manner. They gave the Colorado $500,000, said, here, do this, and by the way, whatever you come up to, that'll be our conclusion on UFOs, Colorado. The whole world said, okay, well, let's wait for Colorado to figure out what they do, because this will be the scientific study. Well, not exactly. It was led by Condon and a man named Robert Lowe. Robert Lowe, I'm almost certain, is the same Robert Lowe that I learned who was doing CIA operations in Albania back in 1948. We know Robert Lowe had a background in intelligence. I think that's significant as the number 2 man on this study. People involved in the study wondered, hey, why are Lowe and Condon so anti-UFO? They were afraid they were going to come to a negative conclusion for good reason. Midway into the project, someone found this memo by Lowe at the beginning of the project, before they even accepted it. Lowe's describing, how will we do this project? He said the trick would be to describe the project so that to the public it would appear to be a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer. There was a mutiny midway through the project. Many of the key members were fired. They wrapped it up with a huge monstrosity of a book, some interesting cases in there, but all the people read were Condon's conclusion, which said, nothing to it, it's all a lot of nonsense. Air Force, as a result, closed Blue Book at the end of 1969. Next slide. Now, this is significant. Why? It's not simply significant because the government, closed out its official UFO investigative body. I mean, look, Blue Book was a front that didn't do any significant investigations after the early 50s anyway. What this did, fundamentally, I will argue, is it undermined our democratic rule. Why? After the closing of Blue Book, you see a UFO, you have nowhere to go. You have nowhere to report it, unless you want to go to a private organization. Okay, fine. And many people say to me, well, why do you focus on the government anyway? Why do you care? We don't need the government to know that UFOs are real. That is true. But there's more important issues involved here, guys. The issue is, I am not willing to acknowledge the total death of the American Republic. I am not. And I believe that it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we have a government that responds to us. Now, is that hot pie in the sky fantasy? You know, maybe, probably, yes. But I maintain this is what I believe in. And therefore, I believe that the United States government has an obligation to fulfill the will of the people. And it has an obligation to, you know, through Blue Book, as much of a travesty as it was our travesty, and it was a wedge also for people who wanted to pry open this topic. There was Blue Book, and you could kind of approach the UFO phenomenon through that. Now it's much more difficult in a way because the Air Force and the military in general denies that they have anything to do with this. This is a serious undermining of our democratic rule, one of many things that have undermined the functioning of our democratic society. Blue Book needs to be recognized as one of those things, the closing of Blue Book. There's a memo by, in the center there referring to the fact that serious UFO reports anyway never go through Blue Book to begin with. They're not part of the Blue Book system. Well, duh, we know this. You read the Blue Book files, especially the later on you go. These are inconsequential sightings, most of them. The few unknowns that Blue Book actually have are usually worthless as evidentiary evidence, as people don't usually realize. People love to quote, Blue Book has all these unknowns. Yeah, but most of them are useless. The best cases are outside of Blue Book. Next slide, please. This is our choice. This is my last slide. We have a choice. We have a choice. I don't know who's making the choices anymore. It is our obligation to know our history. It is our obligation to know the important documentation regarding UFO reality. Otherwise, we become like that guy over there. I love my country, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to blindly believe everything that I am told by those who would rule it. I'm supposed to rule it. You're supposed to rule it. And it is our obligation, as I maintain again and again, that we do whatever we can to make ourselves informed citizens, which is what a constitutional republic is supposed to be based on, and take our power back. Thank you very much. Thank you.